Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected, where we share inspiring stories with artists and art professionals on a wide range of topics, including race, work ethics, inspiration, and the ways in which art influences and is affected by culture. Join us as we continue the journey of sharing the interesting and inspiring stories of some of today's hottest artists and art professionals in the industry. Let's go! On this episode of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected, we're joined by Patrick Alston and Larry Ossei-Mensah. We sat down to talk about how this new body of work came to be, some of the themes that he's exploring in his recent paintings, the relationship that he's developed with Larry over the years, and building relationships based on respect, trust, and vulnerability as key markers for success. In this solo exhibition, curated by Larry on view at Ross and Kramer, Alston showcases work he's been creating over the past year. Born and raised in the Bronx, Alston tackles issues of social economies, identity, language, use of color, and his reflections on the marginalized communities that he sees every day. In this exhibition, titled Let There Be Light, Alston responds to the many trials and tribulations that have impacted working-class urban areas, specifically in New York City, over the course of the last year and during the pandemic. In this episode, we spend much time talking about the use of materiality and the ways in which Alston is challenging himself as a creator and a visual artist, and why community and relationships are so important. I'd like to jump right in. And Patrick, I'd like to ask you a little bit about some of your background, where you grew up, what do you do, just an introduction of who you are.
For sure. So thank you for having me on. My name is Patrick Alston. I'm an abstract painter, originally from the South Bronx. I went to school in Crawfordsville, Indiana, a pretty small liberal arts school called Wabash College, where I studied art and psychology. And then since then, I came back to New York and as of a few months ago, moved to New Haven, actually. So I'm actually working out of New Haven for the time. So that's where my studio is located. I'm currently in a residency in Accra, Ghana, with Gallery 1957, where I'm working on a new body of work that will be displayed later on in the year in London. So that's sort of a little bit of background where I am now and sort of what the future holds.
Can you talk a little bit about how you came to be an artist? How did you find yourself as an artist, and how did you come to the work that you are doing now?
I always tell people when it comes to my background as an artist, I've always been creative since I was young. So I used to draw a lot, primarily like still lives, but never really took it seriously up until undergraduate school. It wasn't until undergrad that I began to meet artists and just learn about how artists have made their careers and living. But art, I think, has always been there from a young age. And coming to where I am now as an artist, it was a lot of experimentation, a lot of sort of looking, a lot of learning, a lot of inspiration from other artists, and basically just trying to find your voice like many other artists try to do. I started out in school painting more figurative work. I found that my voice was best expressed in abstraction.
I love that. We can switch gears a bit and now talk a little bit about your show at Ross and Kramer Gallery, how that came to be, working with Larry, and just what it is that you're working through in the show, the kind of things that you're discussing and speaking about.
It would be best to start with the title and where my interest in light came from. So Larry actually helped to formulate the title, which is Let There Be Light, which obviously has biblical undertones. It's basically the first commandment given by the biblical God within the Bible. I initially became fascinated and interested in light as a student who studied art, primarily studying the likes of Caravaggio, Rembrandt from the Renaissance period, where they came up with this chiaroscuro way of painting, so the treatment of light within painting. So I basically was fascinated by like the romanticism that surrounded light and how light sort of became the core of entire movements. There were institutions built to preserve this idea of a movement around light. So in the show, Let There Be Light, I came to the conclusion after getting down from this like high around the romanticized notion of light. And I noticed that we were treating light from a societal level completely different than what I saw in the appreciation of light from an institutional standpoint. And what I mean by that is basically my last studio in the South Bronx was located in the Mott Haven area of the Bronx. So I noticed a few high rises that were being built in the area. And basically, upon building those high rises were removing light from the community that existed there. And I saw that as a sort of symbolic and metaphysical way that light was being removed from that community. So, from a sort of physical standpoint, and a sort of metaphysical standpoint of light being removed. And I coined the phrase light equity out of that. And I started to question who has access to light, what it means to not have access to direct sunlight from a mental health standpoint. Last year, I think we experienced a lot of issues around mental health. So that was already on my mind. And then just diving in a bit deeper as to how light affects someone's mental health.
And when you say we experience a lot of mental health issues, are you speaking specifically about Black people? Or do you mean the world at large with regards to the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the world at large, but I'm primarily talking about Black people and people within these urban developmental areas, which, obviously Black people, live in very large numbers in these areas. So we're affected most, I would say. So when issues like this do come up, we sort of bear a majority of the burden around that. And the interesting thing is, in the same areas that were affected by urban development and urban planning experienced the highest levels of mental health issues within like the five boroughs, you could say. And that's primarily African Americans within that framework.
Definitely. And as far as being able to sort of trace back certain ideas that come from art history or the intellectual pursuit of art, and then kind of looking into your own life, your own community, where you live, where you spend time, who you spend time with, what parallels have you been able to draw between the study and the intellectual critique of art, but then how it makes its way into the real world in which you live? Like a critical understanding of art, but then also this conversation that you're having about how does that influence the way you then see art in your real life? And when I say real life, I just mean your everyday world.
I use art to speak about these issues. My art is basically just recontextualizing my experiences and trying to formulate those experiences into these abstract forms. So it's my way of expressing the experience that I'm seeing and I'm having from the same environment. The show was developed over a year's time, collecting these materials from the environment that I felt told the story that I wanted to tell. And so for me, it's directly correlated, this sort of history around art and the way that I'm expressing my environment through art.
Yes, beautiful. Can you speak a little bit more about the development stages and that materiality in terms of finding objects, using discarded found objects in your community and neighborhood, and also how those materials signal and start a conversation about larger social economic issues, which I think is what this show certainly centers on in many ways?
I was obviously inspired by my environment. I wanted to pick up pieces from the environment that could tell its own story and help viewers formulate their own thoughts about the works. It's pretty hard to do that within abstraction. So for me, it was key to pick up specific materials. Some being signage that I found from closed stores, or even the opening of new luxury condos or open house signs, and then to juxtapose that amongst one another that could tell this narrative. It was crucial for me to include some of these new materials within the works in order to tell that story and tell that narrative.
Yes, absolutely. Would you say that this is your most conceptual work to date? Do you think that you're tackling issues in this work that you haven't before, and that perhaps you've opened a new door for yourself as an artist and as a creator?
I would say so. I think it's always been there, but it didn't translate as well, especially having Larry for helping me develop this idea that sort of expanded the bounds that I had for myself.
And when you say bounds, do you mean working within restrictions or do you mean working outside of restrictions?
It's more so I was pretty stuck on a very traditionalist way of approaching materiality and breaking free from that, but also expanding my bounds in terms of the work that I make now. I've opened up this new arena of being able to work with an installation. And I didn't want to confine myself to solely working within the forms that I did before.
I wonder if it would be okay to get Larry into the conversation and have a bit of a dialogue between both of you about how this show came to be. You mentioned a few minutes ago that it started its development stages about a year ago. And so much has happened, not only in the last 12 months. And so I'd be super curious to hear what were some of the conversations between you two that led to the show at Ross and Kramer, collaborating together, and some of the input that Larry offered that has brought about these new ideas that you're exploring and new materiality.
Thank you for inviting us to this conversation. I think with regard to Patrick and I, we've been in an ongoing dialogue and conversation over the last several years about his practice, about his work, about his ideas. And for me, it was always about how do you utilize the materials at your disposal and pushing it to its furthest point. But then how do you also, particularly when you're using the mechanism of abstraction as a device to explore things from your environment, from your community, personal questions that you're interrogating, but then also these existential questions. How do you, approach it from, fresh in quotes perspective, right? Because I think it's one thing to make work that features abstract gestures using a canvas that's familiar to us. But I think in our conversations, and it's definitely reflected in the work in the exhibition, I mean, you see vinyl, you see pleather, you see materials that are used for like caulking your ceiling. All these materials that, are very familiar, but we at times maybe take for granted. And then how do you take these familiar materials, recontextualize them, and then, we talk about the window a lot. The window is also kind of a gesture featured in these works, and create a window and an access point for the viewer to be part of this conversation that we're having about light equity, about material, but then also very much about painting, very much about color, gesture. And so we always talk about what are the different entry points that you can provide a viewer without spoon feeding them, but also not creating a barrier. Because like when we look at the climate right now, from a marketplace standpoint, particularly with regard to artists of color, there has been more of attention given to figuration. And a lot of that is because there's still a need, a deep desire, and an imperative for representation when it comes to Black and brown artists and figures. And so we discuss from a material standpoint, how can people see themselves in these materials? Both conceptually but then figuratively. So with some of the vinyl materials, there's a reflective quality where you literally can see yourself in the picture. So that's one thing. The other thing is we talk a lot about Mamba mentality, and just making work.
Can you go deeper into that?
I'm a believer that in order to master your craft, it requires repetition and building that muscle memory. If people were following Patrick on social last year, he had these fragment paintings, which he could talk a little bit more about, which were works on paper. And then he also was just doing works on paper. He did a series, I believe, over 80 days, which Patrick could also talk more about. And so just working that muscle, because so much of it is about energy, it's about a certain velocity. I'm a believer that just comes from continually making. And not everything you make is going to be good, but it does offer potential breakthrough, a learning that could now be utilized for a future painting. But I'll let Patrick talk more about the fragments in those paintings that he was doing, because I think that will give a little bit more context.
Oh, yeah. And just to add on to what you were saying about that sort of repetitive nature and creating, it also helps to solidify your visual voice as an artist. It takes that consistent in the studio practice of painting, experimenting, failing, trying again. What Larry touched base on, like the 80 Days Trials and Tribulations series, which I showed with Lewis and Buell in Detroit, it was along those lines of developing my hand and keeping myself at work when COVID first hit. When COVID hit, I decided to work through my own, I guess, mental health and mental struggles by doing one work a day, just trying to let out whatever emotions, expressions I felt through this series. I would literally either finish pieces or not finish pieces, but leave them as is every day for 80 days, starting when New York City first closed down up until phase one of reopening, which was an 80-day time span. And I then presented that work in an exhibition. Your identity is made up of so many different components. So when I'm sewing works together, I'm thinking about that formulation of identity, but also the fragility of identity. That series came about where I had these works on paper that were already completed. And thinking about that idea of the fragility of identity, I began to disattach myself and disassociate myself from the practice. But the other thing was trying to expand that conversation around the fragility of identity.
Yeah, and then I think also we were just generally having conversations about opportunities to exhibit work, and we concluded that it's time for a comprehensive presentation of the paintings. He had an opportunity to show the works on paper in Detroit, but really hadn't had an opportunity to show the full gambit of the skill set. I think the gift and the trickiness about Patrick's work is that it's often difficult to photograph. One response that we got when people saw the show is like, wow, we didn't realize the depth, we didn't realize the texture, we didn't realize the materiality. That was something that I think we both kind of knew. For me, it was like, let's give people an opportunity to physically see the work. I think with the installation, that was just a challenge in terms of like, okay, you have this rubric of ideas. How do we now change the articulation of it? Right. And so it was manifested through this installation, Retzi, which also has this, double meaning, which I think that's the other thing is that, let there be light, having this biblical reference, but then also literally being about light and color, the emotions that it evokes. And then big shout out to Ross and Kramer Gallery, Todd, Emma, and the team. The space that we were able to put the exhibition in, you actually see the light change over time during the day. I always encourage people, if you can go, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll see how the light literally changes how it hits the paintings. The installation was a nice gambit because it could have been easy to just put up a bunch of paintings. But I think having that installation was a nice challenge for Patrick to work through. But then, too, it gestures towards what's possible in the next projects that Patrick chooses to participate in.
I'd like to touch on what you mentioned with Ross and Kramer. You spoke earlier about the relationship, and both of you have mentioned it, just the kind of relationship that you've built over several years and maybe more specifically over the last 12 months. And I started thinking about symbiotic relationships where each person is not only very invested in the other, but there's a sense that you are feeding off of each other in terms of ideas, right? There's this thing that happens where you have a conversation and the other person leaves and feels a sense of invigoration. Their mind is blown. They've opened up to something new, and this creates a whole new pathway of actual creation. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the relationship that you have with Ross and Kramer, how that sort of came to be, and why did you choose this specific gallery, and I also want to talk about the importance of relationships, not only within Patrick, perhaps your art practice, right? Like your relationship with Larry and other artists, but also you, Larry, your relationship with artists and galleries, and how you find and understand who you want to work with, who's going to be able to share your vision and bring that vision to a wider audience.
With regard to Ross and Kramer, Todd, who's one of the partners at the gallery, we actually met several years ago at an opening for Nina Chanel Abney's show at the Nasher. We really just spent time getting to know each other, and learning to trust each other. So much of life is about relationships and people that you can trust, you can work with, who are going to push you, challenge you, and you do the same for them. And then in 2019, I believe, I had an opportunity to curate a show at Ross and Kramer's former space on the Upper East Side, showcasing the work of John Rivas and February James. And so we organized a 2-person show that went really well, and it was great working with them, and then trying to identify other opportunities to work together. Todd made arrangements to go to Patrick's studio, and he saw the work for the show, and he was blown away. And so it's been great working with them on the exhibition and being able to bring this to life. But I think in general, so much of what I've been able to access and execute and articulate in my career is because of relationships, whether they be loose relationships, people I just know, and it's just a good vibe. I think as I've gotten older, I want to work with people I trust and that I can honestly communicate with and that we're on the same page, because there's just so much friction in life for a myriad of other reasons, that to work with people who get it and we're going in the same direction, who has the desire to execute on the highest level, one, just makes it fulfilling.
Patrick, will you chime in a little and share?
Some people have asked how I got to know Larry, how our relationship developed. And it's after we got a chance to know each other for a bit, it became really interesting because the majority of our conversations that we have are not even really about art. It's more so about other things in life that we're interested in. If I have a question or if I shoot him an idea, he digs into his lexicon and his archive of experiences and the way that he's able to sort of draw connections to my ideas, to reference points that he has. Like he said, he was just someone I knew I could turn to and trust to ask some of those questions that I had. And I think it's just the comfortability of working with a person and having somewhat, we're both from the Bronx, so having similar backgrounds and just knowing where we both want to go and what our contributions will be to the current art world and in the future.
A lot of people are saying that we're going through what you might call a Black Renaissance, right? A new Black movement in art. And it feels to me very much like sort of sometimes being in the fishing bowl and sometimes being outside of it as an observer, that people tend to be more focused today on the relationship building that you're talking about, the trust that you're talking about. And with some people you work with, you might not have that, right? And you might not have that experience where you've built that trust. But relationships are the foundation and the center point with which you can comfortably and with a lot of vulnerability go out into the world and create new things and even experiment in one's own art practice. And whether that's as a curator and a facilitator of ideas, or whether that's as a practicing artist who's mark making and making work. So I'm just really interested and curious to talk a little bit more about how the relationships that you've cultivated, Patrick, over a period of time opened up the space for you to explore your work in a new way. Because this is the first time you're exploring sculpture, like an installation, right? It's the first time you've done that. And I think that in coming to the opening and seeing the work and seeing the show and talking to you and seeing the work specifically, there was definitely, from an outsider's perspective, because I didn't know you at the time very well, and we're still getting to know each other, and I hadn't seen your work in person up until that point, there appeared to be a very big stage of evolution, right? And I sort of am just making the assumption that a lot of that evolution can trace its roots back to meaningful relationships that you've built over the years that have allowed you the freedom and vulnerability to explore your practice.
Yeah, you hit that right on the head. So, for example, I first met Larry during a studio visit a few years back, and he was, when he came by the studio, he was very blunt in his assessment of the work that I was doing, and I respected that there wasn't any cushion around what he felt about the art and what was lacking within the work, and I immediately felt that this was a person that I needed in order to push the work forward, if anything else. Developing relationships where I was able to trust perspective of people helped me draw conclusions of my own work. When I first had the installation idea, I sort of shot it to Larry as this really crude drawing. He really got the idea almost immediately, but then as quickly as he understood the idea, he started shooting back questions as to why I want to put this in the show, the materiality of the work, and just making sure that everything I was doing in the show was intentional. And I think intentionality is another word that comes up here, is intentionality behind pretty much everything. So I think that looking for relationships that enable you to get that critical sort of set of eyes and critical thought is essential within my practice, but also within trust. I think you can trust someone who's truthful.
Right. Even if that truth is one that you don't necessarily agree with.
Oh, of course. I mean, as an artist, you put work out into the world and you know that you're going to receive critique from it. I had to set my pride aside as an artist and look at it as this is advice given by someone who's seen a lot of work in their life and who is in the midst of this current revolution that you're speaking of.
To piggyback that, I think with regard to like studio visits, critique, feedback, I've conditioned myself to just make sure that the feedback is coming from a point of view that's aiming to be constructive. The dialogue that Patrick and is ongoing. There are times where I have like said things and he's like, "Nah, that's not what it is." I think it's important that he is able to articulate when it is and it isn't, because then I think it just reaffirms for him, what it is he's aiming to execute. So it's never me trying to find the answers for the artist, but it's just more so asking more questions, or at least posing a prompt that then gives them something to chew on as they're working through whatever it is that they want to create.
Also, who you're in conversation with. I think that was one of the things that really helped out, is like, pointing out artists that I didn't really consider or know of that was sort of having the same dialogue I was having within abstraction. Being able to point that out and letting me know.
Can you speak a little bit about the
What
intentions of
conversations
the
are
show
being
and what
had,
you were hoping
so that I
and
can
what
build
you
off
were
of
hoping
those
to get
was
out of the
very
show?
helpful.
In terms of the intentions with the show, I think ideally providing a platform for Patrick's work to be seen in totality in a group, providing a space where people can physically see the work. And then third, just creating a condition where people can kind of just see art again and reconnect. I think it was interesting to kind of just be a fly on the wall and just watch. Even during install, we had people who were stopping by like, what is this? Who is this? This is amazing. Wow. This makes me feel so light. This makes me feel so amazing. And so, for me, it was like, how can art be a vehicle for joy? I think when people begin to unpack what the work is about and the show is about, it was really exciting to just kind of hear their reads of the work and say, oh, like with the Concrete Boys, one person's like, oh, this reminds me of like a biblical tablet. And I was like, oh yeah, that could be accurate, or drop ceilings. And there's this idea of like the viewer completes the work and seeing them draw their own conclusions, bring their own experiences to the work, to the exhibition.
I love that.
I would have to completely agree with that. And it's interesting that Larry brought up the joy that painting brings. And I think that just the conversation around light and these paintings being the sort of physical manifestation of light, I wanted people to appreciate these paintings as, these auras, these really exciting examples of accessibility to light.
Beautiful. And then just questions about relationships, masculinity, being vulnerable, being open. Can you all speak, especially as Black men, can you speak a little bit about how the relationship that you've built over several years has allowed both of you to remain open, remain vulnerable, and how that openness and building that trust has created a deeper relationship for both of you, but also a safe space to create, and also the ideation phase, right? The phase of just talking through things before you even get to creation.
So I'll touch on that really quickly. I think this idea of a safe space, it's a bit contrary, because I think being open is not necessarily a safe space. If I guess internally, I think there's still a struggle in being open and accepting critique. But I think that opening up that space is the only way that we can come together and grow and understand one another. So I think it's definitely important. There's a lot more conversation around the openness that we have amongst one another. And I think the more and more we do it, the more and more we'll see these results of success and growth.
Absolutely. Larry?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it does come down to trust and also wanting to see, Patrick win as an artist, right? Because I'm a believer that when your friends, your colleagues, collaborators win, you win, right? And I think there's growth that comes from that. And the reality is that no one is successful or finds success, however they define that for themselves, alone. It takes collaboration. It takes, alliances. It takes partnerships. It takes individuals that you can be in dialogue with to help you continually make sure that you're working with intention, with clarity, with conviction. Because at the end of the day, as I, grow in my curatorial practice, Patrick will sometimes has insights and points of view, and this vice versa in terms of his practice as an artist. And then also for me, just curatorially, it's always been about going on the journey with the artist, right? And it's not just about this one show, but it's like it's about these multiple stages, milestones that will hopefully reach in life. And to be able to do that with comrades and colleagues and friends that you trust and respect, I think it makes it more fruitful and more special.
Agreed, 100%. Well, I think that this has been a great episode, and we touched on some super important points. And thank you both for your time and for your participation. I'm glad we finally made it happen.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Thank you for having us.
No, we appreciate you. Thank you so much.
There you have it, folks. It's a wrap. That was our episode with Patrick Alston and Larry Ossei-Mensah. Make sure to stop by Ross and Kramer Gallery before the show closes to see Patrick's newest works in this incredible sold-out show. And it's a wrap, folks. That's our episode of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. Conversations on culture and current events with some of today's hottest creative contemporaries. These episodes were recorded in between New York and Miami over the past 6 months and reflect the times we are living in, while also adding some commentary to the social, cultural, and political issues of the past year. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay motivated, stay inspired, and stay up. Peace and love, y'all. We out.